Black Friday had never been my thing. The chaos, the crowds, people fighting over waffle makers, it always seemed more ridiculous than worth it. But this year, my brother, Alex, begged me to go. He wanted the latest gaming console, and they were doing a doorbuster sale at the new Crescent Bay Mall. He couldn't go himself because of work, so I caved. Figured I could be a good brother for once. Crescent Bay Mall had just opened a few weeks earlier, and it was massive. The kind of place designed to lure in crowds with sleek storefronts, glowing signs, and endless corridors. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was already packed. People were streaming into the mall, the buzz of anticipation thick in the cold November air. I checked my phone. The gaming store Alex mentioned was at the far end of the second floor. Perfect. I could grab the console, avoid the food court insanity, and be out before things got truly crazy. At least, that was the plan. The gaming store was a madhouse. Shelves were being emptied faster than the employees could restock, and the line to the register wrapped around the store twice. I wasn't even sure they'd have the console in stock when I got to the counter. I spotted a rack near the back of the store with a single box left, Alex's console. It was slightly out of reach, perched high on the shelf. I climbed onto the bottom rack and stretched until my fingers grazed the edge of the box. Just as I pulled it down, someone tapped me on the shoulder. "You need help with that?" a voice asked. I turned to see a store employee, or at least that's what I assumed. He wore a uniform shirt but no name tag, and his face was oddly blank, his expression flat. "I'm good," I said quickly, clutching the box. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was his lack of reaction, or the way he stood just a little too close. "You should check the fit," he said, nodding toward the back of the store. "There's a fitting room. Make sure it's what you need." I stared at him, confused. "It's a gaming console. I don't need to try it on." His face didn't change, but he took a step back, gesturing insistently toward a small door at the end of the aisle. Just to be sure. I was about to argue when I saw another customer glaring at me, eyeing the box in my hands. Not wanting to draw attention or lose my prize, I muttered a quick, "Fine," and headed toward the fitting room. The door was plain, unmarked, and slightly ajar. The corridor behind it was dimly lit, far quieter than the chaos of the store. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the short hall, my grip tightening on the box. The fitting room itself was small and claustrophobic, with a single mirror on the wall. There were no chairs, no hooks, just a mirror and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I leaned the box against the wall and stared at the mirror. It looked off. The glass was slightly warped, distorting my reflection in subtle but unsettling ways. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered. I crouched to open the box, but before I could, the lights flickered. The hum of electricity grew louder, a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. I stood up, staring at the mirror. My reflection was staring back, but it wasn't quite right. It tilted its head when I didn't, its eyes narrowing like it was studying me. I froze, my chest tightening. "What the hell?" I whispered. The reflection smiled. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the box. My heart was racing as I reached for the door, yanking at the handle. It didn't budge. The latch clicked, but the door stayed shut, like it was sealed from the other side. "Hey!" I shouted, pounding on the wood. "The door's stuck! Let me out!" The mirror rippled, the glass shifting like the surface of a pond. My reflection stepped forward, moving closer to the surface. It pressed its hand against the glass, and cracks spiderwebbed outward from where its fingers touched. I backed away, my mind racing. This isn't real. This isn't happening. The mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 windows breaking at once. I shielded my face with my arms, waiting for the shards to hit me, but nothing happened. When I opened my eyes, the room was gone. I was standing in a long, dark corridor. The walls were smooth and metallic, stretching endlessly in both directions. A faint blue light pulsed from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the floor. "Where am I?" I whispered. The box was gone, The fitting room was gone, and the noise of the mall had vanished completely. All that remained was the corridor and the sound of distant footsteps. I turned, squinting into the darkness. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, its outline hazy and indistinct. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky, like it wasn't used to its own body. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its head tilting to the side, watching me. The blue light flickered, and the figure moved closer. Not walking, just appearing, as if the space between us didn't matter. I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the cold metal walls. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice echoing down the corridor. The figure tilted its head again, its body twitching unnaturally. Then it raised an arm, pointing at something behind me. I turned and saw another door. It was identical to the one I'd come through, unmarked and slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light spilled from the crack. Without thinking, I ran for it. I burst through the door and found myself back in the store, or at least I thought I was. The racks of clothes were there, the shelves stocked with merchandise, but everything was wrong. The colors were muted, the air heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The store was empty. No customers, no employees, just an oppressive silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The lights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A mannequin stood near the entrance, its glossy face tilted toward me. I was certain it hadn't been there before. I took a step back, my pulse pounding. The mannequin's head jerked to the side, its arm rising in a stiff, unnatural motion. Then the lights went out. The darkness was overwhelming, suffocating, like it was alive. My breath echoed in the void, shallow and quick, as I stumbled backward. Somewhere, in the pitch black, came the faintest sound, a slow creaking, like a door opening, or maybe, footsteps. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. It bounced off unseen walls, swallowed by the silence. The lights flickered back on, dimmer than before. The mannequin that had stood near the entrance was gone, but I wasn't alone. Figures dotted the aisles now, their forms stiff and lifeless. More mannequins scattered across the store, their blank faces turned toward me. Except, they weren't all mannequins. I saw movement in the corner of my eye, subtle, but unmistakable. One of the figures shifted, its head tilting unnaturally. I froze, my heart hammering, and stared as its arm jerked upward, pointing toward the back of the store. Slowly, its plastic legs creaked forward, dragging it closer to me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." I turned and ran, weaving through the aisles, knocking over racks of clothes and shoving past empty carts. The mannequins didn't move like humans, they didn't chase me. They just appeared, every corner I turned, closer than they should have been. I reached the back of the store, panting, my chest tight. The door I'd entered through was gone, replaced by another fitting room. This one was larger, the walls lined with mirrors that stretched to the ceiling. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting distorted reflections on the glass. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Behind me, the sound of plastic feet dragging against tile grew louder, closer. I didn't have a choice. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, impossibly cold, my breath visible in the freezing air. The mirrors reflected me from every angle, but something about them was wrong. My reflection didn't match my movements. Sometimes it lagged, other times it moved too soon. One reflection smirked while the others stayed blank. I stepped forward, and the mirrors rippled, like the surface of water. Shadows shifted behind the glass, too many to count. They were tall and thin, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness. My distorted reflections began to fade, replaced by those shadowy figures. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadows didn't respond. They just moved closer to the surface of the mirrors, pressing against the glass. Cracks formed beneath their hands, spreading outward in jagged lines. The sound was deafening, like ice shattering in a frozen lake. I backed away, my legs trembling. "Stay away!" The lights above me flickered wildly, and then the first mirror shattered. A shadow poured out, its form fluid and shifting, its limbs too long, and its head tilted unnaturally. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I ran for the door, but it wasn't there anymore. The walls had closed in, smooth and seamless, trapping me inside. The only way out was the mirrors. "Take your place," a voice whispered. It wasn't one voice, but many, layered and disjointed, coming from all around me. The shadows surged forward, their movements jerky and inhuman. I grabbed a broken shard of glass from the floor and swung it wildly, the jagged edge cutting through the air. One of the shadows recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a pipe, but it didn't stop. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The mirrors cracked and shattered one by one, spilling more shadows into the space. They didn't touch me, but they didn't need to. The air grew heavier, thicker, like it was pulling me down. I stumbled backward onto the pedestal that had appeared in the center of the room. My legs felt weak, my movements sluggish, as if the shadows were draining the strength from my body. The whispers grew louder, chanting in unison now. "Take your place! Take your place! Take your place!" The mirrors that remained intact rippled again, and my reflection returned. But it wasn't me. The figure in the glass was still and lifeless, its eyes empty, its body posed like one of the mannequins. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I won't." But the shadows had other plans. I don't remember how it happened. One moment I was struggling, fighting against the suffocating weight of the air, the pull of the shadows. The next, everything was still. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of the store again. The chaos of Black Friday had returned, shoppers filled the aisles, employees rushed to restock shelves, and the sound of frantic voices echoed around me. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I was safe. That it had all been a nightmare. Then I tried to move. My body didn't respond. My arms stayed at my sides, stiff and unyielding. My legs were rooted to the ground. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't even scream. I wasn't in the store. I was part of it. I watched, helpless, as shoppers passed by. None of them noticed me, just another mannequin posed near the entrance, my face blank and unchanging. But I could see them. I could feel them. And every so often, one would stop, glancing at me for a moment too long, as if they could sense something was wrong. The shadows aren't done. The mall isn't done. It always needs more. And now, I'm waiting for someone to take my place. Black Friday was always a nightmare, but this year, I was desperate enough to dive into the chaos. My girlfriend, Chloe, had one very specific request, a designer jacket that was half off at a trendy boutique in Glendale Mall. She'd been hinting about it for weeks, and I figured grabbing it would score me some serious points. How bad could it be? When I arrived, the mall was already teeming with people, a human tidal wave crashing through every store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as people pushed past me, shouting about deals and dragging overflowing carts. I checked my phone for the boutique's location and headed straight there, determined to grab the jacket and get out as fast as possible. The store was chaos. Clothes were everywhere, on the floor, draped over racks, stuffed into carts. The employees were visibly frazzled, trying to restock faster than people could grab. I wove through the crowd, scanning the racks until I found it, the jacket. Chloe's perfect jacket. The last one on the display. I snatched it before anyone else could. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A flicker of doubt crept in. What if I got the size wrong? Chloe had been specific about that too, and returning anything on Black Friday was a logistical nightmare. I spotted the fitting rooms in the back corner of the store, surprisingly empty amid the chaos. It seemed like the perfect solution. I'd try it on, double-check the size, and avoid any future arguments. The fitting room was oddly quiet compared to the rest of the store. There were no employees nearby, no chatter, just the faint hum of the lights overhead. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The latch clicked into place, and for a moment the noise of the store felt like a distant memory. The mirror in the fitting room was tall and clean, reflecting every detail of the cramped space. I slipped on the jacket, turning to check the fit. It looked great, perfect actually, but something about my reflection felt off. It wasn't the jacket. It was me. I leaned closer, studying the mirror. My reflection stared back, but there was a strange delay, almost imperceptible but definitely there. I raised my hand, and it followed, just a fraction of a second too late. A chill ran down my spine. Okay, I muttered to myself. Weird mirror. No big deal. I turned to leave, but the latch wouldn't budge. I jiggled it harder, but it was stuck. Panic started to rise in my chest. I banged on the door. Hello? The door's stuck, I called out. No answer. I pounded harder, but the noise outside seemed muffled, like I was yelling underwater. I glanced back at the mirror, and my heart stopped. My reflection was gone. The room seemed darker now, the fluorescent light overhead flickering faintly. I stepped back from the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, the glass shimmered, like the surface of a lake disturbed by a stone. Then something moved on the other side. It wasn't me. It wasn't anything human. A shadow slithered across the mirror, its form shifting and stretching, limbs too long, its face a blank void. It pressed against the glass, its head tilting like it was studying me. I stumbled back, hitting the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. This isn't real, I whispered. This isn't happening. The shadow raised a hand, its fingers sharp and spindly. The glass rippled under its touch, bending outward as though the mirror wasn't solid anymore. My body froze, paralyzed by fear as it pushed further, its hand breaking through the surface. I snapped out of it and lunged for the door, yanking on the latch with all my strength. The metal creaked, and the door burst open, spilling me out into the store. I hit the floor hard, my knees scraping against the tile. But the store wasn't the same. The once crowded boutique was now silent. The racks were empty, the shelves bare. The fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Dust coated everything, like no one had been there for years. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. Is anyone here? No answer. I stepped forward, my shoes crunching on broken glass scattered across the floor. The fitting room door was gone, replaced by a blank wall. My heart pounded as I spun in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened. Then I saw them. Mannequins. Dozens of them, standing motionless in the corners of the store. They hadn't been there before. Their featureless faces seemed to watch me, their stiff, plastic limbs posed unnaturally. I took a step back, and one of them moved. Its head jerked toward me, the sound of creaking plastic echoing in the silence. Its hand twitched, raising slowly as if to point. Stay back! I shouted, but my voice cracked. Another mannequin moved, its arms shifting, its legs stepping forward with stiff, unnatural motions. They weren't fast, but they didn't need to be. Every movement felt deliberate, like they were hurting me. I ran. I burst out of the store and into the mall corridor. The chaos of Black Friday was gone. The crowds, the shouting, the noise, it had all vanished. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the polished tile floor. Help! I shouted, my voice echoing. Someone, please! The only response was the faint sound of footsteps. Not my own, something else. I turned to look and froze. The mannequins were in the corridor now, scattered among the storefronts. They were closer than before, their heads tilted in my direction. One of them raised a hand, its fingers beckoning. I stumbled backward, my breathing ragged. This can't be real. The footsteps grew louder, joined by a low, guttural sound, like a distant growl. The mannequins moved again, their stiff limbs jerking as they closed in. My chest tightened as I realized there was nowhere to go. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed me whole, broken only by faint flickers of light from the overhead fixtures. My breaths came in sharp gasps, echoing in the emptiness around me. The mannequins were close. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them. Their stiff, plastic joints creaked with every movement, and the sound of their dragging feet scraped against the tile. "Stay away," I whispered, more to myself than anything else. Something shifted in the dark. A faint glow appeared ahead, casting weak light onto the walls. It wasn't the fluorescent lights. It was colder, bluish, almost like moonlight. I squinted, trying to make out the source. There, in the glow, stood a single mannequin. It was posed differently from the others, its head tilted sharply to the side, one arm stretched forward, pointing at me. The shadows around it twisted unnaturally, like the light was alive, bending and stretching to its will. The words came again, a low, guttural whisper that echoed from nowhere and everywhere. "Take your place." I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. My hands scraped against the wall as I tried to steady myself. "What do you want from me?" I yelled into the darkness. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the empty space. The glow grew brighter, and I realized it wasn't coming from a light. It was coming from the mirror, the one from the fitting room. It was standing in the middle of the corridor now, suspended in the air, its surface rippling like water. Something moved inside the mirror. A shadow, humanoid but grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long and jointed at angles that made my stomach churn. It moved toward the glass, its blank face pressing against the surface as though it was trying to break through. The glass began to crack. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, running blindly down the corridor. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, as if the walls were closing in around me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the mannequins were there, their stiff forms jerking closer with every second. I rounded a corner, my chest heaving, and found myself in the food court. It was empty, the tables and chairs overturned, the floors littered with debris. But something else was wrong. The mannequins were here too, sitting in the chairs, their blank faces turned toward me. Some held trays of fake food, their plastic fingers curled tightly around them. As I moved through the room, their heads turned to follow me. Slowly, one by one, they stood. "No," I muttered, backing away. "Stay away from me." They didn't listen. Their movements were slow but relentless, their plastic feet dragging across the floor. I turned and ran, weaving between the tables, my heart pounding in my chest. I found another corridor and sprinted down it, desperate to escape. The lights flickered more violently now, plunging the hallway into bursts of darkness. The shadows stretched and twisted, moving in ways that made my skin crawl. At the end of the corridor was a door. It was unmarked, but it was open just a crack, spilling faint light into the hallway. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the door and slammed it shut behind me, my back pressed against the cold metal. I was in another fitting room. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting distorted versions of myself. One mirror showed me pale and gaunt, my eyes hollow and lifeless. Another showed me trapped behind the glass, pounding on it with bloodied fists. The center of the room was empty, except for a single pedestal. On it was a mannequin. Its blank face was tilted upward, its arms raised as if it were waiting to embrace something, or someone. I turned back to the door, but it was gone. The wall was solid now, the faint outline of the frame replaced by smooth, featureless metal. The voice returned, louder this time, surrounding me. "Take your place." The mirrors began to ripple, their surfaces shimmering like liquid. Shadows poured out, pooling on the floor before rising into humanoid shapes. They surrounded me, their blank faces staring, their limbs twisting unnaturally as they moved closer. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not staying here." One of the shadows reached for me, its hand cold and weightless as it brushed against my arm. My skin burned where it touched, the pain searing through me like fire. I stumbled back, tripping over the pedestal. The mannequin's head jerked toward me, its movements sudden and violent. Its arms reached out, and for a moment I thought it was going to grab me. Instead, it pointed to the mirror directly in front of me. The surface rippled, and I saw myself. But it wasn't me. The reflection was twisted, its face blank, its body rigid and lifeless. It was me as a mannequin. No! I screamed, clawing at the walls, at the floor, at anything I could grab. You can't have me! The shadows surged forward, their voices a deafening roar. Take your place. I don't know what happened next. The world around me blurred, the shadows closing in until I couldn't see anything but darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of the store again. The chaos of Black Friday was gone. The racks were empty, the shelves bare. The lights buzzed faintly, casting weak shadows on the floor. I tried to move, but my body felt stiff, heavy. My arms hung at my sides, my legs rooted to the ground. I looked down and saw my hands. They weren't hands anymore, they were plastic. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the store filled with new shoppers, their laughter and chatter echoing around me. They didn't notice me. To them, I was just another mannequin, posed in the corner of the store, my face blank and unchanging. But I'm still here. I can see them. And sometimes I can hear the whispers. The mall always needs more. Black Friday isn't for the faint of heart. People trampling each other for discounted TVs and designer jeans? I'd always thought it was madness. But this year, desperation won out. My girlfriend, Natalie, had her heart set on some jacket she saw online, and after weeks of hinting, she finally just said it. If you really love me, you'll go to Ridgeway Mall and get it. So there I was, standing outside the mall at 6 a.m., clutching a coffee I'd barely had time to sip. The air was cold, and my breath fogged up as I muttered curses at the line of people swarming the entrance. Ridgeway was already lit up, neon signs flashing discounts and promises of doorbuster deals. When the doors opened, the crowd surged forward like a stampede. I held my ground, not wanting to lose my footing and get crushed. People shoved past me, screaming about deals and grabbing carts. The chaos was surreal, but I was on a mission. I made my way to the second floor, dodging elbows and stepping over abandoned coffee cups. Natalie had sent me the exact details: a boutique store, middle of the mall, selling a limited edition jacket. It's the green one, she'd said. Don't mess it up. The store was small but packed. Clothes were flung everywhere, on the floor, over racks, and people shouted at employees who were clearly seconds away from quitting. But there it was, the jacket, hanging limply on a half-empty rack. Only one was left, and miraculously, it was in Natalie's size. I grabbed it, relief washing over me. A woman nearby glared at me like I'd stolen her life savings, but I wasn't about to let go. It wasn't until I looked at the tag that doubt crept in. It was expensive. Way more than Natalie had said. I had the sinking suspicion I'd picked up the wrong one. Before I could overthink it, I spotted an empty fitting room near the back of the store. Just try it on, I muttered to myself. Make sure it's right. The fitting room was unusually large, with tall mirrors on every wall. It was silent inside, a stark contrast to the chaos just outside the door. I slid the latch shut behind me, hanging the jacket on the hook. As I turned to face the mirror, something felt off. The mirror was flawless, no smudges, no scratches, but my reflection didn't seem right. It was me, sure, but there was a faint delay, like the reflection was a fraction of a second slower than my movements. I waved my hand experimentally. My reflection waved back, but the delay was just enough to make my skin crawl. Get it together, I muttered, shaking my head. I slipped on the jacket, glancing at myself again. It fit perfectly, the fabric smooth and expensive looking. Natalie would love it. But as I admired the fit, the lights flickered. The room dimmed for a moment, and when the lights came back, the reflection was different. I wasn't looking at myself anymore. The version of me in the mirror wasn't wearing the jacket. His clothes were ripped and dirty, his face pale and hollow-eyed. He stared back at me, his lips moving, though no sound came out. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. What the hell? The lights flickered again, and the room grew darker. My reflection took a step forward, though I hadn't moved. I turned to check behind me, nothing. Just the same empty fitting room. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. Panic clawed at my chest. I reached for the latch on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, twisting the knob, but it felt like it had been welded shut. The walls seemed to close in, the once spacious room now stifling and cramped. "Hey!" I shouted, pounding on the door. "I'm stuck in here! Somebody help!" No response. The muffled sounds of the store had disappeared entirely, leaving an oppressive silence. My reflection still hadn't returned, the mirror now showing an empty fitting room. But something about the glass shimmered, like it wasn't quite solid anymore. I leaned closer, my breath fogging up the surface. The shimmer grew stronger, rippling like water. And then, without warning, something darted across the mirror, a shadow, humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "This isn't real," I whispered. "This can't be real." The mirror rippled again, and the shadow reappeared, standing just on the other side of the glass. It tilted its head, as if studying me. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, a swirling black emptiness that made my stomach churn. "Let me out!" I screamed, slamming my fists against the door. The sound echoed strangely, as if the walls around me weren't solid anymore. The shadow moved closer to the glass, its head still tilted. Then it raised a hand, long, spindly fingers pressing against the mirror from the other side. The glass warped under its touch, bending inward as though it were a sheet of rubber. And then the mirror began to crack. The first crack was small, a faint spiderweb pattern radiating from the shadow's hand. But it spread quickly, the sound of shattering glass filling the room. I backed into the corner, my legs trembling, as the cracks spread to every corner of the mirror. The shadow stepped through. It didn't walk or climb, it just glided, its body passing through the broken glass like it wasn't there. The air around it grew cold, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. It stood in the center of the room, its head tilting again as it turned toward me. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Just let me go." The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it raised one hand, pointing at the door. The latch clicked, and the door creaked open. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door, pushing past the heavy wooden frame and stumbling back into the store. But the store wasn't the same anymore. The shelves were empty, the lights dim and flickering. Clothes lay scattered across the floor, coated in dust. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The chaos of Black Friday was gone, no shoppers, no employees, just an eerie, suffocating silence. I turned back toward the fitting room, but the door was gone. Just a blank wall where it had been moments ago. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. "Is anyone here?" A faint sound reached my ears, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. And then the lights went out. The darkness was suffocating. I stood frozen, my breath loud and ragged in the silence. Somewhere in the pitch black, the sound of footsteps grew louder, deliberate and slow, each one echoing like a drumbeat. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against metal. I squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes forming in the dark. A faint glow emerged ahead, illuminating the silhouette of a mannequin. Its plastic limbs were twisted at odd angles, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. It wasn't there before. My legs locked up as I backed into a rack of clothes. The sound startled me, and I turned, desperate to find another way out. The faint glow from the mannequin flickered, like the light was alive, struggling to stay awake. And then it moved. Its head jerked toward me, the sound of plastic grinding against itself. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as the mannequin raised an arm, its fingers curling in slow, deliberate motions. Behind it, shadows began to ripple and shift, forming shapes that were vaguely human but wrong, too tall, too thin, their movements erratic. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice breaking. The shadows surged forward. I bolted, my hands clawing at racks and shelves as I sprinted toward the atrium. The mall, once a sleek and modern space, had transformed into a nightmare. The lights above flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The stores were no longer pristine but filled with broken glass and overturned displays. Dust hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I reached the atrium, hoping for some sign of escape. Instead, I found mannequins. Dozens of them lined the circular space, their featureless faces all turned toward me. Some stood in store windows, others posed on pedestals like they were waiting for something, or someone. Their glossy plastic bodies gleamed faintly in the flickering light, and their blank stares seemed to follow me as I moved. "Where's the exit?" I whispered to myself, spinning in circles. And then I saw it, a single door on the far side of the atrium, its outline glowing faintly. Hope surged through me, and I sprinted toward it, weaving between mannequins. Their heads turned as I passed, their movements stiff but deliberate. I reached the door and grabbed the handle, yanking it hard. It wouldn't budge. "Come on!" I shouted, pounding on the door. A sound behind me made me freeze. The mannequins were moving. Their arms jerked upward, their legs shifting in small, unnatural steps. One by one, they turned toward me, their stiff joints creaking as they began to close in. I pressed my back against the door, panic clawing at my chest. "Please!" I begged, tears streaming down my face. "What do you want?" The answer came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice low and hollow, like wind whispering through an empty room. "Take your place." The mannequins surged forward, their movements faster now. I ducked and ran, weaving between their stiff forms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. One of them reached for me, its plastic fingers grazing my arm. The touch was ice-cold, numbing my skin and sending a shock through my entire body. I stumbled into a side corridor, the mannequins close behind. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until I felt like I was being funneled towards something. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint sound of whispers filled my ears. "Take your place," the voice repeated, louder this time. The corridor opened into another fitting room. This one was larger, its walls covered in mirrors. The reflections were wrong, distorted and cracked, showing versions of myself that didn't match reality. One mirror showed me pale and hollow-eyed, another with my head tilted at an unnatural angle, my limbs twisted like the mannequins. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The mirrors rippled, and shadows poured out like ink spilling into water. They took shape, forming humanoid figures that loomed over me. Their faces were voids, swirling with darkness, and their limbs were too long, their fingers sharp and clawed. "You don't belong here," I whispered, shaking my head. "I just wanted to leave." One of the figures stepped forward, its movements smooth and fluid, like it was gliding. It raised a hand, pointing toward the center of the room. I turned to see what it was indicating and froze. There was a mannequin standing on a pedestal. But it wasn't a mannequin, it was me. Its face was blank, but its posture, its clothes, its hair, it was a perfect replica. The shadows circled it like vultures, their whispers growing louder. "Take your place. Take your place." "No!" I screamed, backing into the mirrors. The glass was cold against my skin, but it rippled like water, pulling me in. I clawed at the surface, desperate to escape, but it was like quicksand. The harder I fought, the deeper I sank. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the store. The chaos of Black Friday was gone. The racks were empty, the displays overturned. The lights flickered above me, and the air was thick with dust. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky, and looked around. The fitting room was gone. So was the pedestal. But something felt wrong. My movements were stiff, my limbs heavier than they should have been. I raised a hand to my face, and my breath caught in my throat. My skin was smooth. Plastic. I stumbled toward a shattered mirror on the floor, my reflection staring back at me. My face was featureless, my body hollow and lifeless. I wasn't me anymore. They say Ridgeway Mall is cursed, that people sometimes disappear on Black Friday, swallowed by the chaos. If you ever shop there and feel like someone is watching you, stop and leave. Because that mannequin in the corner, the one that looks a little too lifelike? That might be me.